Whether you're just getting into the hobby or have been keeping fish for decades, we all fail, we all kill fish, and we all have to learn from our mistakes. In this video, we're going to talk about 5 common reasons people fail and how to set ourselves up for success. If you're new to the Fish Cave, welcome. If you end up learning something from today's video, make sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing. The first reason I want to talk to you today about why people fail in fish keeping is not doing water changes, or not doing enough water changes, or doing too many water changes. Pretty much it boils down to water chemistry, water parameters, and not understanding it. Or maybe you've been keeping fish for a while, you understand it, but you forget why we do things we do. The bottom line is the water parameters dictate when we need to do a water change. And in an ideal situation, we know our tank or tanks well enough that we know that a weekly water change of X amount percentage or a bi-weekly water change or whatever that schedule is will maintain that tank. It's really important to note that those aren't going to be the same for every tank. You may have a heavily planted tank with just a few shrimp that goes 6 months without a water change, no problem. Or you may have a heavily stocked cichlid tank that needs a 50% water change once a week or twice a week in order to maintain the ideal water chemistry for that tank. We also can't forget that sometimes an aquarium works despite the fish keeper's best efforts. And I've been very guilty of this in the past where it seemed to be doing well, fish were dying, I'd add more fish, but it seemed to be doing okay despite me not doing any water changes or understanding the parameters. And just because some fish survived and did well doesn't mean I was doing it right. So I run into people all the time that tell me, oh, I haven't done water changes in forever, 3 years. And just because some fish may or survive, it doesn't mean that's the ideal situation. In order to set ourselves up for success and help prevent our water parameters from getting out of whack and thus helping prevent potentially killing fish, we can just invest in a water testing kit. I use an API master test kit. I have an Amazon link to my affiliate link below. I use that. I use a TDS meter, which definitely check out my video on TDS meters. I wouldn't recommend everybody purchasing one, but they definitely have their place, especially when you have a bunch of tanks like this and you don't want to be using your test kit to check all the different tanks all the time. A TDS meter is a quick way to get a general reading of what's going on in the tank, and it's very general. And that brings us to the second reason I want to talk about today of why people fail in the fish keeping hobby, and then we're going to talk about how to succeed instead. And that's getting fish too often. The community tank syndrome, let's call it. Whereas you buy one tank, maybe it's a 10 gallon, a 20 gallon, maybe it's even a 55 gallon, and you start out with some fish. Let's say you even do step number 1 right, you filter, you get it all cycled, your water parameters are in check, and now you have fish. You had a few fish. But you know that you can add more fish. So the next week you go out and you add more fish to that tank. And then maybe a few days later, oh my God, they're having a sale, you add more fish to that tank. And then what happens? One fish gets sick, half the tank dies, maybe the whole tank dies, you get upset, you wasted a bunch of money, you may even leave the hobby for good. Like I mentioned, it's something that I used to do all the time. How do we fix it? A hospital tank or a quarantine tank. Simple. Even if you have a 5-gallon tank or a 10-gallon tank, if you want to continue to add fish to that tank, you're going to need somewhere to quarantine fish. Anytime you're going to introduce fish to your tank and it's coming from an outside source, especially a pet store, even if it's a friend of yours, I recommend quarantining that fish first to prevent any transfer of diseases. The great news is there's a few times a year you can pick up a 5-gallon tank and a 10-gallon tank for $1 a gallon from Petco's $1 a gallon sale. So I recommend, no matter what tank you purchase, think about getting a hospital tank or a quarantine tank soon thereafter. It can be very bare bones, nothing special, but definitely invest in one. It'll save you in the long run for sure. Since we own 2 dogs, I would never want to introduce a 3rd dog to the household unless I knew for sure that it has proper paperwork and shots and was certainly healthy. And we should do the same for our fish. What brings me to the 3rd thing I want to talk about. So the 3rd reason I want to talk to you guys about today is people don't treat fish like a pet. Now, if Bo here were a fish and I didn't do the proper research to home him with our other dog, right, that wouldn't be good. So we want to make sure that when we own fish, that we do the proper research and compatibility. So treat the fish like any other pet that you would. Come here, Bobo. Good boy. Now, if it's common knowledge that some species of dogs, or some dogs in particular, have shown a history to not get along well with cats or small dogs, for instance, you wouldn't want to introduce them to your home or your fish tank. It's no different than trying to add a red devil with guppies. You wouldn't want to add potentially a dog that is trained to hunt cats with a cat in the household. Right, Bobo? You ready? Go. The wife and I did a little research before we adopted Bo. We knew that he'd be a pretty big dog, but we also knew that we had a fenced-in yard and that we could provide him with walks frequently so that it would be a good fit. Just like I knew that when I kept the Red Devil cichlid that I had a 125 with open space, so I'll be good to go. The good news is we can easily prevent a lot of failures by just doing research. And keep in mind that just because you do research and you find out that one combination may not work, doesn't mean it won't work for you. So definitely I would recommend doing a few, taking a few different opinions and then doing a little bit of your own research if it's warranted. The fourth thing I want to talk about happens to all of us, especially the ones that have been in for years, if not decades, and that's the burnout. You jump in the hobby, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, you get 1 tank, 2 tanks, 3 tanks, 6 months later your tanks are full of algae, you haven't changed the water in a month and a half, and you're like, oh, why did I keep fish to begin with? I know you guys exist out there because I go and buy your tanks. It's going to happen to all of us at one time or another, but how do we help prevent it from getting out of hand? If you're losing interest in your tank, try to interact more with that tank, try to add an additional plant species, potentially a fish species, if you've already quarantined it, of course. Potentially add a second tank. Now, I'm not saying go full multi-tank syndrome and build a whole rack system. If you ever do go crazy and decide to do a fish room or multiple tanks, make sure you automate as much as you can. You will thank yourself later. You need to automate stuff or else you will get bored of it. It will overwhelm you. The maintenance will get too much. Make sure you automate it. But even if you're going to jump into a second tank, make it a shrimp tank. Or maybe shrink down. Maybe only keep a plant-only tank. Just because you won't have enough time to do water changes every week, keep a tank that you don't need to do water changes on. Another cool way to interact with your fish tank is to culture a live food. Maybe it's in another small tank, maybe it's in a little plastic container, but when you culture a live food and now you're raising that live food in addition to the fish tank, that adds some more interaction. I also highly recommend making local fish friends, join a local aquarium club. It'll help keep you involved into the hobby and you don't necessarily have to increase the amount of tanks you have. You can go visit your friends' tanks, talk to your friends about their tanks, and that way you're not adding additional responsibility and additional maintenance and pressure on you and your hobby, but you're actually adding more pleasure, gaining more knowledge, and sharing your experience with others, which is a big part of what I get out of this hobby. The fifth reason I want to talk to you guys today of why people fail, and man, this one hits home really hard because I suffered from it for a long time, and I still suffer from it, I think, in some regards, but it's not having patience, it's overreacting or doing too much, and learning that sometimes less is more in the fish keeping hobby. Back when I just had a 55-gallon tank and a 29-gallon tank, all I wanted to do was breed bristlenose plecos, and it seemed like it took a year and a half. In reality, I think it took maybe a month or two to get them to breed and have my first successful batch. But all I had was those 2 tanks. And my wife can tell you that in the cichlid tank, all I did was rearrange the rocks every freaking day. In the other tank, all I did was try to rearrange that tank to make it happy for the plecos. And all I was doing was too much. I was overreacting, I was doing too much, I was monitoring the tanks too much, trying to mess with the parameters, and I ended up learning that less was more. Unfortunately, I learned the lesson by getting more tanks, and when I started ramping up tanks, I paid less attention to individual tanks, and before I knew it, I had bred bristlenose plecos, and cherry shrimp were going crazy, and one of the tanks down here I left alone, I did nothing with, and it was doing better than any other tank in my rack system. And that's when I learned that, oh my gosh, sometimes less is more, do enough, get it right there, and then be hands off. Let the tank settle in, let it become aged, and don't mess with it too much. To go along with dialing in the pH and the temperature and all the parameters to a specific amount and making sure they never change, I think also what I've got into in the past was trying to over-diagnose a potential problem with a fish or plant and maybe trying to do too much in order to solve that issue. Don't get me wrong, it's very important that if you see something different or a potential, a bacterial infection or a fungus infection, to treat that. In the past, I myself have been quick to diagnose stuff or misdiagnose stuff sometimes. So I think what I've learned is it's important to kind of take your time, only make adjustments, make them small when necessary. If you're interested in some more fish keeping tips, check out this video here. If you want to learn how to do stuff on the cheap, here's a playlist right here. I appreciate you guys watching. As always, stay positive and stay passionate. That's a wrap.